Hello, I'm going to talk about two things today, and these are from questions that I got that were kind of incidental to the demonstration of the video I made on how to pack your backpack. One of them is going to be, the first one is going to be on the kind of sleeping pad that I use, and then the second one will be a little bit about my cook kit. So when it comes to sleeping pads, I think, what you have to know about yourself, I find is important is, are you a back sleeper or a side sleeper? And if you're a back sleeper, you have a pretty good chance at being able to sleep on a closed cell pad, which would be, no inflation, folds up. There are several of them out there that are made, they either fold up or roll up. ThermaRest makes a pretty popular one. And that's pretty bulletproof. You're not going to get a leak in that. So if you're like me though, and you're a side sleeper, that closed cell pad is just not thick enough. At the hips and the shoulders, you still pretty much compress that, and it's just the ground. So the importance of sleep on the trails, you can't underrate that or undervalue it. So what I have done is I have a few different pads that I use under different conditions. But the pads that I use come out of the same family, which are the ThermaRest Neo Air family. And they make, I think, 4 different pads. And within each one of those pads, there are different sizes. There are 2 in that family that I particularly use. One is the ThermaRest Neo Air X-Lite, which this one is, and the other one is the ThermaRest Neo Air Ultralight, which this is. So let me talk for a second about when I would use each one of these. So the Ultralight is a fairly new pad from ThermaRest, and it's the lightest one they make. So it's lighter because the skin on it is a little bit thinner, which means more easy to puncture. And it's also got less insulation in the pads, lower R value. So this is really for sure, a shoulder season pad, spring, even late spring, summer, fall. You get temperatures like, you start getting into like the 40s, I think this pad becomes a little less comfortable. This was a regular length, which meant it would have fit a 6-foot person, but I cut it down, which is something I often do on a summertime pad, as I cut the bottom and I reseal it. That's something that I could demonstrate in another video if there's some interest in that. Why would I do that? Well, because it makes this smaller and more compact, which means I can use a smaller backpack. Smaller backpacks are lighter. Inflating and deflating it, there's less volume there when you cut it to do that. And the important thing for me when I'm sleeping is to have the pad underneath me, kind of pretty much from my head down to maybe halfway between my hips and my knees. That's kind of how long I want my pad to be. And then I just put my backpack and extra clothing or whatever I have on the tent floor underneath the pad or below the pad, and I have my feet on that stuff. And that works really well for me. I'm really happy with that arrangement. But again, this is something for warmer weather. In addition to one of the conditions being warmer weather, another important condition is not being where there's a lot of pokey stuff that's going to come through and puncture your mattress. Obviously, it can be repaired. Anybody that uses inflatables much has, woken up at night with the thing flat, and you have to repair it. It's not that hard to do, but it's a little bit of a hassle. And sometimes leaks can be hard to find You know, it's easy at home when you can stick it in the bathtub and find the leak, but out on the trail, sometimes a real small one can be elusive. Of course, there are a couple of things that you can do to mitigate the risks. You know, here's the polycryo ground sheet. I almost always put one of these underneath my tent. They won't stop, you know, like a cactus thorn or something. So if you're hiking the Arizona Trail or desert hiking, this is not what I would use. It's more for like pine cones, you know, twig kind of things. It's quite light. When hiking something out in the desert where there's just like a lot of pokey stuff, I use this, and this is Tyvek. It's not the construction weight of Tyvek. This is actually I got this from a website that sells kite making equipment. This is Tyvek that's used for a kite. So it's a little lighter, a little flexible, a little quieter than that construction grade Tyvek. But this is what I use under more, when the conditions are a little riskier when it comes to something coming through the tent floor and into the bottom of the pad. Another thing that I will often carry is, this is a 1/8 inch Closedcell pad, and I can put this underneath my sleeping pad. They're pretty close to the same length actually. So this would provide also just a little bit more insulation perhaps, and a little bit more protection against something coming through. This gets folded. There's kind of a certain way I fold it for my backpack, and then it goes into the backpack on the outside against my back, so it's the pad on my backpack. So I use it for sitting down during the day and sleeping on at night. The other pad that I frequently use is this one. This is the ThermaRest Neo Air X-Lite, and it has a higher R value. I want to say it's 3.4. I don't have the R values on the top of my head, but I have slept on snow with this. They make one with a little higher R value than this one. Of course, it's a little bit heavier, maybe a little bit more expensive, but this one is the full length. It's 6 foot, because if it's cold, the little thing that I do where I put my feet on my backpack, which has pretty much no R value, that just isn't all that comfortable, and you know, trying to sleep with your feet cold, that can be a tough job. So this is the one that I use when it's colder, or I might use if I think there's a greater risk of something poking through and puncturing my pad. When I hiked the Arizona Trail, I used one like this with Tyvek. I got through without a single puncture. Kaylee got one puncture. They make this one in a small, which means it's the length that I was talking about earlier. It comes down halfway between my hips and my knees. And I hiked the PCT with one of those. I've kind of given up on those because they're also not quite as wide as the regular one. So what I prefer to do is buy a regular one and cut the bottom off to the length that I want, so that I still have the shoulder width. It's just less trouble staying on top of the pad, and since I use a quilt, I like to make sure that there's enough pad for the quilt to come around on the sides and stay with no big gaping holes. So that's pretty much what I have to say about pads. I do recommend the ThermaRest Neo Air line. If I were in Norway, for example, I would probably, and I just wanted to have one pad, I would probably go with the ThermaRest Neo Air X-Lite, because in colder weather, even, you know, frosty temperatures, this one's going to work okay for you. And it's not as heavy as I'm trying to think of the name of the one. Xtherm, yeah, it's the NeoAir Xtherm. That's the high R value one. And if you were going to be out, you know, doing serious winter stuff, you'd want that one. But I think if you were just going to have one pad, I would get this one. They actually make a women's size, which is just a little bit smaller, and I think has a little bit higher R value in this particular one, the X Lite. So that might be worth checking out. There are two little hacks that I will show you that relate to the sleeping pads. One of them is I take seam sealer. It's kind of a stuff in a tube. Hang on, let me find some real quick. Okay, this stuff here is a seam sealer. So if you have a tent that's silicone impregnated polyester or nylon, this is this stuff that you would use to seal the seams on the tent. And one of the things that I find it to be useful for is it's really nice if you have a flat place to put your tent, but you don't always have a really super flat place. Maybe it's just a little bit canted, and what happens is that the pad can start sliding around on the tent floor, you know, so you find yourself kind of surfing inside of the tent at night, staying on top of the pad. So what I do is I will put lines of this across the bottom of the pad, and you can see there's 3 right there. Hopefully those show up. And then there's a space, and then there's a few more down here. And that's really all it takes. It remains not tacky, but what would I call that? It's just, once it dries, it will be kind of a point of traction on the tent floor, and it just makes the thing stay in one spot, and that's actually a pretty nice thing. The second hack I have is something I can demonstrate later if there's some interest in that, and that is just that if you're using so I'm referring back to the little video I did on how to pack a backpack. If you're using a pack liner, as I do, to waterproof your stuff inside of your backpack, it's also possible to use that pack liner as a pump to inflate your pad. And that's something that I do, and there are a couple of benefits to it. It's kind of it is, I have to admit, it's kind of tiring. You know, you get to the end of the day, you've been going all day long, and you stop and start to set up your camp, and one of the things that you've got to do is blow up your pad, and I don't know, it feels like a chore. And so using the pack liner to do that kind of makes that go faster and easier, number one. Number two, you're not blowing a lot of damp air from your lungs into the pad, which eventually turns into mildew in the pad, and it wrecks the insulation on the inside of the pad. It just preserves the life of the pad to use some kind of a pump. I didn't do that for years because I just didn't want to carry anything that did it, but then I started using my pack liner to do it. And on a recent hike that I did out in the Ozarks, doing the Ouachita Trail and the Ozark Highlands Trail, I used that and was real happy with it. Okay, so that's pads. All right, I'm going to say a few things about my cook system, and this is something that works for me. Here's what I like about it. I don't want to be in the position of washing pots or pans or dishes. I don't want the hassle, and I don't want the mess, and I don't want to encourage critters to come around my camp. So a system that works well for me, I only cook 1 meal a day, that's supper. And I do sometimes cold soak, but I prefer to carry a stove and cook. but my cooking consists of boiling water. So my supper will be things like Knorr rice sides combined with like parboiled rice, dried veggies, dried black bean flakes with some spices, something that's pretty nutritious, but normally something that you would cook on a stove top and there'd be some simmering involved. But the way that I do it has worked pretty well for me. I've been using this basic system, I don't know, for 7, 8 years now probably, and been pretty happy with it. So my cook kit, this is just the cook kit. This isn't really the important thing about it, because what you want to do is basically end up with enough hot water. This is just a little thing I made to be able to use my pot as a coffee cup. This is my pot. This is 650 milliliters, and this is exactly how much water I need to cook my supper. So what I do when I get ready to make supper is I turn on the stove. I'm not even going to show the stove because it doesn't even matter. I turn on the stove and I get the water boiling. So that takes a little while to happen. And then the other part of it is that any backpacking trip I go on, usually I'll start off with a store-bought freeze-dried backpacking meal. This one is called Kathmandu curry. And the reason I start off the trip with one of these is because I want the envelope. I want this. So after I eat the meal, which of course you just pour the boiling water in, you let it sit for a while. I have this. After I eat, I pour water into it again, swash it around, and I just drink the water. So now it's clean. So this is a little thing that I've made from Reflectex, which is, you know, for like insulating pipes and water heaters and stuff. It's pretty cheap stuff. I have a roll of it, and duct tape. So what I will do is, my water's cooking, you know, the little stove is doing its thing. I open this up and I dump what I'm gonna eat for supper in here. It's usually in a little baggie. So that goes in here. And then this, I put inside of this envelope, so it's insulated. Once the water boils, I take the little pot. I usually have a bandana or something so I don't burn my fingers. I pour the water in, I seal it, then I close it up, and I just lean it up against a tree. And then I go about putting my tent up, or you know, whatever chores I've got. And it takes about 15 minutes in here. And in about 15 minutes, rice, noodles, veggies, anything that I've put in here that's dried will have rehydrated. And of course, the amount of water you put in depends on the amount of food you put in. The amount of food I put in, I need 650 milliliters of water. And then it's done, and it's hot. You have a hot meal in here, and I just have a long spoon, and I just eat out of this. And once I've eaten all the food out, I put water into it. I just put cold water into it, close it, shake it around, drink the water. Now it's quote unquote washed. You know, my chores are done. And I put it into my bear bag because obviously it's got pretty strong scent to it. And that's it. There's no cleaning to do beyond what I do, where I just swish it around and drink it. Sometimes that has to happen twice, but it's generally pretty clean. One of these freeze-dried envelopes I have found on the trail. I've never had one break. I tend to use Backpacker's Pantry. I don't know why. Maybe because they have a few vegan meals and I like those. But usually like on a long trail, like every 30 days, I rotate out and get another one. So I get another freeze-dried meal. And I just do that, not because I think the thing's gonna break. I've never even think I've even come close to that, but I just kind of wonder about the plastic on the inside and getting onto the food and all that. So that's what I do for my cooking, quote unquote cooking. And that has worked really well for me for years. I'm totally satisfied with that system. And other than little tweaks I make to like the stove and that part of my set, I don't really, haven't found any improvements that I can make on it right now. But I'm always open to those. All right.